Espionage, hackers, and spies. Today's Cybercrime Junkies episode involves true stories of secret espionage behind certain major breaches and what Chinese espionage means to America. It was a sunny, hot, humid afternoon in Shanghai, China. The man folded his piece of paper while walking out of a crowded market, pushing past an elderly woman mumbling to herself in a regional dialect. As he hurried down the street, beads of sweat began to run over his brow. He thought to himself, what are they asking me to do? Will the morality police arrest me? Send me off to a work prison if I don't do this? But my family needs the money. I have to get this done. He confided in a friend by burner phone later on that day. Of course I lived my childhood in the Midwest and believe in the United States. I enjoyed growing up there. But I have to look out for my family, man. And I have to do what's best for me. He knew he had access to certain systems that, if turned over to the Chinese government, would be devastating to U.S. citizens, causing private confidential personal information to be in the hands of people who would track, hunt, and watch every move of those unknowing Americans for decades to come, using it against them as they pleased. He also knew his life was in shambles. He hadn't eaten for days due to paralyzing anxiety. His wife has stage 4 cancer. Their house is nearing foreclosure. His 12-year-old autistic daughter needed treatment, and his moderate government salary was causing his family to drown in a sea of crippling debt. What happened next changed the trajectory of foreign relations. It led to U.S. indictments of several key Chinese government official computer hackers and ruined the lives and privacy of tens of millions of Americans. This is Cybercrime Junkies. I'm your host, David Morrow, and now the show. Come join us as we dive deeper behind the scenes of security and cybercrime today, interviewing top leaders from around the world and sharing true cybercrime stories to raise awareness. But first, a huge thank you to all of our executive co-producers who subscribed to our Prime membership and fueled our growth. So please help us keep this going by subscribing for free to our YouTube channel and downloading our episodes on Apple or Spotify podcasts so we can continue to bring you more of what matters. This is Cybercrime Junkies, and now the show. So what is the difference between breach and espionage? There are data breaches, and then there is cyber espionage. The difference between a breach and espionage lies in the use of the stolen data. The modus operandi, the way and mannerisms that the criminals used, and international law, treaties, and sanctions. The ripple effect can be in the loss of life, imprisonment of people involved, the loss of billions of dollars above and beyond the cost of remediating the data breach and systems involved themselves. The core cyber military people we are discussing today are allegedly working for the Chinese government. But as we all know, there are equally dangerous organizations from the Russian regions and North Korea. We'll touch on those toward the end, as there's recent news involving those as well in this same topic. Cybersecurity implications of all of these are monumental. A few main data breaches that hit the news in the past few years are discussed usually in terms of the data breaches themselves, the amount of data that was exfiltrated, which, as we always point out, is a fancy way of saying it was stolen, the impact on the users, and the wonderful free credit monitoring that people receive, and how bad the security either was or was not that led up to the breach. But there's a bigger story behind certain breaches, the ones that are ignored or silenced in common media, right? Because there might be reasons, there might be national security reasons, or they just might not be something that is the flavor of the day. It might be taken the place of by some Kardashian news or something else, right? But the breaches we're going to talk about today are important because it's much more than just the breaches. We're going to talk about the Anthem Breach, the Equifax breach, the breach of the OPM, which is the Office of Personnel Management for the U.S. government, and the breach involving Marriott International that happened in 2018. In many specific ways, and you will see, these breaches were all related. because these breaches have widely been reported in the media as simply data breaches, massive thefts of data to be sold on the dark web. But there's a story behind the story, and that's what this is about. But what is it? What's really happening here? As U.S. Attorney Bill Barr said, on the one hand, quote, this data has economic value, and these thefts can feed China's development of artificial intelligence tools, as well as the creation of intelligence targeting packages. We're going to explore what that means, right? And it's even more than that. And what's surprising is what some of the ultimate charges that are brought against the people that have been identified that work for the Chinese government show in those documents, and what they don't show to the American public. So let's walk through each breach, high-level business sense discussion without getting too technical. And let's talk about them in chronological order. I mean, it's better to listen to a timeline that happened in reality anyway, right? It's always easier to listen to something in order as it happened in real life. So the Equifax breach. Even if you're not familiar with who Equifax is, you certainly have experienced their services. More importantly, you, dear viewer or listener, are most likely a customer of Equifax and was affected in this breach. You may not even know that. Have you ever borrowed money for a car, rented an apartment, or bought a house? If so, you know that they run a credit report, and that report gives you a score, a number, a FICO number, right? A FICO score. That's a combination of three main credit bureaus, companies that track all of your spending, payments, report if you pay a bill 3 days, 30 days late, 60 days late, if you've ever been evicted, suffered a bankruptcy. They have it all of the dates, all of the payments. They have everything about you. In school, we got grades, right? As an adult, you have grades too, and that's your FICO score. You have a FICO score. And to have a FICO score, you get those scores from those three main credit bureaus, TransUnion, Experian, and our wonderful subject of today's conversation, Equifax. In March 2017, personally identifiable data of more than 140 million U.S. citizens was stolen from Equifax. 140 million. The breach exposed several scandals and launched Equifax to the very top of the list as the poster child of what not to do for security for an organization. Equifax was criticized for everything, ranging from their terrible security posture to their alleged insider trading by executives and bumbling response to the breach. Most importantly, the questions of who was behind the breach has serious implications for the global political landscape. Like watching a slow train wreck, a major data breach like Equifax involved international cyber espionage. It's the type of disaster resulting from a series of bad decisions. And like a slow train wreck, people can't help but watch. Down into the details or researching more. Our research involved dark web mining, and we strongly discourage you from doing that. But there's also some surface web resources like an article from CSO Online, a detailed report from the U.S. General Accounting Office, in-depth analysis from Bloomberg Business Week, as well as several other articles, which we will link in the show notes. So getting to the Equifax data breach, here's basically what happened. Equifax was initially hacked, compromised through a common vulnerability, and they simply failed to patch that vulnerability. It has been something that was widely known in the security and IT and tech space to simply patch. When we say patch, all we mean is, on your desktop when it says you have an update, like your MacBook has an update, your iPhone has an update, right? You need to do those things within a reasonable time. Why? Because there's usually security implications and things like that. And now there's a whole host of practical reasons why people delay, because usually they need to test those patches, because when you patch something, it may break something else. But they didn't even do that. One single IT resource failed to patch what was commonly being patched across the industry at the time. And then they ran another scan, right? And they did that, what is said to have done improperly also, and they failed once again to patch that. So now you have common exposures that anybody, any moderate, level skill set hacker or threat actor or some hacktivist or somebody curious would be able to get in. And this is a big company with a lot of things, in their possession. What we just saw is like 2 or 3 different layers of common basic hygiene that just wasn't done. Now, enter China. And I don't mean the people of China, not at all. When we talk about this, we're talking about the Chinese government, the communist government of the country, China, and their cyber mercenary team. So the attackers were able to get in, right? Exploit this vulnerability that was left unpatched and then scanned and left unpatched again. And they were able to move from the Equifax web portal to other servers throughout the organization. And here's yet another poor security act by Equifax. The systems weren't adequately segmented from one another. So once they got in through the web portal, they were able to access the keys to the kingdom, right? Which is a basic fundamental tenet not to do. These threat actors were able to find usernames and passwords stored, right? Yet another security flaw, in plain text. So here's one of the things that we always talk about, right? If you are holding the usernames and passwords of people, you need to encrypt it, right? You need to salt or pepper the data. Salting means you put random series of numbers in the beginning. Peppering means you put random series of numbers at the end. What we mean is, let's say you have a whole list of social security numbers, right? And you have a small business, right? And you have this, let alone a huge business like Equifax. But if you have that, you have a duty to not do that job negligently, right? And what you need to do is salt or pepper that data. Why? Because if somebody steals it, whether intentionally or not, or that data gets lost, right, that somebody can't use that data. So if you have a whole series of, say, 5 random numbers before, and you know that the social security number actually starts on the 6th number, right, then you'll be able to use that data all you want. But if somebody steals the data, they won't know what the actual social security number is. So they couldn't use it anyway. Well, that wasn't done here either. It was done in plain text. So username, the actual username is right there. Passwords, the actual passwords are right there. Social security numbers, the actual social security numbers are right there. Data, driver's license, all of that, credit information, all of that in plain text right there. This allowed, because the hackers were able to access the usernames and passwords that were stored in plain text, they were easily allowed to access other systems throughout the entire organization, all undetected, right? And yet, by another security error, the attackers exfiltrated, again, a fancy word for steal, a ton of data, all undetected. So they didn't have the systems in place to be able to catch the fact that all of this data was being pulled out. Why weren't they detected? Well, because Equifax had crucially failed to renew their encryption on their internal security tools. And what also puts them at the top of the wall of shame, as if all of this wasn't enough, is Equifax didn't publish to the public about this breach until more than a month after they discovered it had happened. So data breach happens. Time goes by. They discover the data breach, and then they do a bunch of things before they tell any of the people that were the victims. That's what leads them to the top of the wall of shame. And during that time, stock sales, right, by top executives give rise to accusations of insider trading. What that means is top executives know once this hits the public, our stock is going to tank. We're going to sell our stock now, and we're going to buy futures, which are called options. We're going to buy puts, which go up in value when the stock price goes down. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they did. The Equifax breach affected 143 million people, almost 1/2 of the entire U.S. population. Think about that. Not all of the U.S. population has a FICO score or was even in their system, but this captured 1/2 of the entire population. And the names, addresses, dates of birth, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, payment history, private financial records, payment to healthcare organizations, all of that information was exposed and was stolen, right? This also included credit card numbers as well. So who were the threat actors? Who were the hackers? The threat actors who committed this monumental heist, right? Who were they? Like, who are these cyber criminals that caused the largest financial breaches in US history? Well, that would be something that any cybercrime gang, think, if you have ever listened to this podcast before, think about Lockbit, Clop, Black Cat, right? What would they do if this were them? They would proudly claim that they did it, right? They would proudly claim it on their dark websites. They would issue proofs of life. They would show proof that they had done it. They would demand extortion, ransom. They would do one of those things prior to leaking all of this data, making it public for all of us to see, right? They would often even tweet about it, right? On social media, on the surface internet that we all see. Part of their business model, after all, is to leak the data and to extort victims by threatening to do that, even targeting some of the individual victims themselves. And after doing that, what would happen? Well, we would see identity theft. We would see credit being issued for people that didn't do what the identity theft resulted in. We would see false tax returns filed as a result of this, all tied to this massive breach and the data leaks that always follow it, right? So we clearly would have heard from one of these gangs, one of these cybercrime criminal outfits, right? In this historic, massive financial crime. I mean, there's nothing that's been bigger than this financially. Not when you think of the actual payment history and everything that makes up your ability to buy a home and everything else. They have it all, right? Well, no. Here we heard the sound of silence. Nothing. As soon as the Equifax breach was announced, security experts and even fellow cyber criminals alike grabbed their popcorn and began taking tabs on the dark web, looking at all the sites, waiting for the huge dumps of data and somebody to claim that they did it, who was connected to it. They waited and they waited, but the data leak, the extortion, the ransom claims, all of it never appeared. To this day, nothing. Why not? Well, most people are completely convinced the motives weren't financial at all. The motives were cyber espionage. And this monumental heist was not done by any of the cybercrime gangs, but rather by the Chinese government. 140 million Americans, greater than 40% of the US population, who had all of their financial transactions and complete financial private histories stolen. This would have been worth billions of dollars to sell on the dark web. Not tens of millions. This is buy several islands type of money. Billions in street value. And here, nothing. Think to yourself, why? A massive breach of financials like this would lead to a rash of identity theft, fraudulent charges, extortion claims to keep the data quiet before being leaked. Everything we hear about happening today and every day in the news, like about the Move It file transfer breach, right? The breach involving the Clop ransomware gang. Everything we hear about Lockbit, Black Hat, all of the major healthcare breaches that we've seen, they all involve the same thing. Cybercrime gangs take credit for it, they extort for it, or they ransom it, and they get paid. It's why they do what they do, right? But here, nothing. Zero is the number of fraud or identity theft cases that can be traced back to this incident. None. American citizens were left with $125 each. That is the most they could ever expect by spending a lot more time filling out forms and systems in order to get that. And of course, there was the wonderful free credit monitoring. That will cure it. Equifax itself wound up spending $1.4 billion, that's with a B, on upgrading its security after the breach. Wonderful. And their C-suite was ousted. Wonderful. Among allegations of insider trading and poor security practices. So what's the tie to the Chinese government? Seems pretty obvious. It's not one of the standard cyber criminal gangs, but what's the tie to the Chinese government? Well, there's no leak site, like we mentioned. no extortion demands, no sale of stolen data, no identity theft from the victims. So experts point that this was clearly state-sponsored because it wasn't financially motivated. Okay, but what ties into China versus Russia or North Korea or one like the Lazarus Group or one of these other groups? What ties it straight to them? Well, most of the experts in the reports that we've seen says look at the timeline. See, there was an international détente going on between the United States and China back in 2015 between these two states, right? Requiring them to stop cyber espionage. It was top of mind for both organizations. And there are numerous other examples at the time that China had seemingly been violating that détente. And what's more, the timeline is absolutely critical to understand. So let's walk through it. Let's take a look at the timeline. So, as we mentioned, there was this international détente on hacking agreed between China and the US in 2015. China had seemingly been violating this in a couple other instances, but let's talk about the timeline of the Equifax breach itself and looking at it and looking at the MO, the modus operandi. And we've discussed MO in prior episodes. Think about MO in a typical crime scenario, right? You hear that there's a rash of break-ins in your neighborhood. Okay, that's bad. So maybe make sure you always lock the door at night. Okay, we always do that, right? Not really a big deal. But that doesn't tell you anything about the MO. What if you knew what the police knew? And that is that the break-ins are always happening on Wednesday morning between 5 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. And they're always breaking in on a side window right by a laundry room every single time. And they always use a certain type of crowbar, and they always walk up 2 steps, like use a ladder to get there every single time. That's their MO, right? That's something unique about this criminal. That's their footprint, right? Because what could you do if you knew that information? You would make sure that during that time each week, right, you would have extra cameras, extra lights over on that part of the house to be able to defend about it. That's why understanding cybercrime and understanding the MO behind certain crimes is so critical, so that you can know how to defend it. And in the digital space, just like a regular crime, there are digital MO, there are TTPs, there are techniques, protocols, processes that they use. There are digital calling cards, digital footprints, breadcrumbs that they leave. And here, those were present. So additional clues beyond the fact that the stolen Equifax data was never leaked point directly to that timeline. So think about this. The initial breach happened on March 10th of that year. Then nothing for 2 months. So what investigators believe is that somebody, because the breach happened, the initial access, right? That breach happened by anybody could have gotten in because Equifax had very poor security hygiene. They just simply hadn't patched very commonly known vulnerabilities. It's like, hey, your window's open. You should really shut the window. No, we're fine. We don't do that. And then time goes by. Everybody's talking about the windows being open. Everybody shut their windows open. You do a scan. You take a look at the whole house. You see the windows open, and you still don't do it. You still don't shut the window. And somebody walks in and goes, hey, I found a way inside, right? But the fact that 2 months went by until any next step is very common in the industry for what's known as IABs. Initial access brokers. What these people do is they gain the initial access, but they don't have the technical skills or the desire to go to prison, and they don't want to go and nor do they have the technical skills to do anything with that, right? They just see, hey, there's a window open, right? And we can give you the address to it. We can show you where the window is, right? And so they'll just list access on the dark web for a few $1,000s, and they'll make their money. Because they just know for the amount of time that they spent, which wasn't much for this one, right? It wouldn't have been much. They can make a quick buck and really good money when you think of $1,000 an hour or even higher, right? So the odds are that the belief is that that's what happened here. And then it winds up in the hands of an APT. An APT is an advanced persistent threat group. Advanced means that he have advanced technical skills. Threat meaning that they're going to do harm. And persistent meaning it's a nation state actor. It's persistent. They don't quit. They have armies of these threat actors that work 24/7 in shifts, right? It's nonstop. It keeps going until the mission is accomplished. Always undetected. always effective. And that's what happened here. So the details are this. So what happens is once an initial hacker gains access here by using any of the standard hacking tools, since Equifax hadn't patched or encrypted or turned on its ability to detect exfiltration, right? They wouldn't be able to tell when hackers were taking the data out. And then what happens is this. After 2 months, then you start to see activity where the threat actors move around from system to system and get access to various systems, moving laterally left and right, vertically up and down, right? Without being detected in various different types of systems and throughout a pretty complex network. All of that requires advanced technical skills and top tools. And above all else, it takes persistence. So when cyber espionage is discussed, the groups of APTs are the ones that remain persistent, and the persistence is the operative term. So why would the Chinese government be interested in Equifax data records? Well, here's the context. We're going to get into this toward the end because what we're talking about now, think about it when you zoom in on a painting, an oil painting. If you get too close, you just look at what exactly was done and the tools that were used here and the methods of moving and all of that and the fact of not being detected, all of that required an advanced technical skill. It wasn't a group of hacktivists. It wasn't just a random hacker, right? This was nonstop, non-going once that 2-month gap happened, right? Which shows you like that initial access broker turned it over to somebody that really knew what they were doing. But if you look too close to that, like an oil painting, right? All you see are the colorful dots. But when you step back, you're able to see the whole picture. You're able to see the Rembrandt, right? You're able to see the context in which this was done. So let's talk about that a little. The investigators there tie the attack into 2 other large breaches that similarly did not result in any dump whatsoever of personally identifying data on the dark web, all around the same time. And that was the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, the OPM breach, and the 2018 hack of Marriott's Starwood hotel brands. All of these breaches are assumed to be part of an operation to build a huge data lake on millions of Americans, but with a target for a few subsectors of those Americans. The intention of using these big data techniques to learn about U.S. government officials and intelligence operatives. In particular, evidence of American officials or American spies who are in financial trouble. Why would they want to know that? Because that could help Chinese intelligence identify potential targets for bribery or blackmail attempts. Digital breadcrumbs that were tied to the Chinese military hackers in the Equifax breach were the result of a long period of investigation that the U.S. government did to uncover the ties to specific individuals that worked for the Chinese military. The FBI conducted a broad kind of multinational investigation involving team members from around the world, and it was led by the FBI's Atlanta field office. And they tracked those crime digital breadcrumbs that we talked about back not only to China, but actually to specific members of the Chinese military and the way that they configured all of the servers and exfiltrated the data and moved the data around. That was the MO that was seen here and that was seen in the other breaches we're going to talk about. They allegedly used servers in various countries, like over 20 different countries, and approximately 40 different IP addresses to disguise the origin of where the attack came from. And it's the same thing that's been used in several other ones, and they were able to draw it to specific individuals and actually bring federal indictments against those individuals. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. And now we're going to turn it over and focus on the next critical breach and how that one is all part and parcel to this whole Rembrandt painting of the espionage that we've been talking about. And that is the breach of the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM. And that's going to be right after Well, that wraps this up. Thanks for joining, everybody. Hope you got value out of digging deeper behind the scenes of security and cybercrime today. Please don't forget to help keep this going by subscribing free to our YouTube channel at Cybercrime Junkies Podcast, and download and enjoy all of our past episodes on Apple and Spotify podcasts so we can continue to bring you more of what matters. This is Cybercrime Junkies, and we thank you for joining us.